Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the longest, most devastating, and honestly heavily overlooked battles of the entire Second World War. We are heading into a dense, 10-kilometer-wide stretch of woodland in western Germany, a place so brutal it literally swallowed armies whole and earned the terrifying nickname the Green Hell. We're going to break down exactly how the Battle of Hurtgen Forest unfolded, why it turned into such a massive, inescapable strategic trap, and the very real scars it left behind that you can still see more than 75 years later.
You know, the author Ernest Hemingway actually witnessed the bloody battles right in the heart of this forest back in November 1944. And his words here perfectly capture the sheer survival horror of the Hurtgenwald. Think about that for a second. It wasn't just the enemy soldiers you had to worry about. The environment itself was relentlessly lethal. It was a place where just existing, just standing there, was an absolute struggle against death.
I want to pause for a moment to let this number really sink in. 25,000. That is the staggering estimated number of American and German soldiers who perished in this very forest over 5 agonizing months. Behind that number are tens of thousands of individual stories. Soldiers who suddenly found themselves completely bogged down in treacherous terrain, facing conditions they simply couldn't have ever prepared for.
Part 1. The Siegfried Line. A rapid advance hits a wall. Okay, let's look at the momentum right before the fighting began, so we can understand how the Allies actually ended up in this nightmare.
Think about the timeline of the Allies' rapid advance across Europe. After the D-Day landings in June 1944, they swept across the continent, liberating Paris, Brussels, Antwerp. By September, the 1st U.S. divisions had already reached the Belgian-German border. I mean, this was lightning fast. They were more than 3 months ahead of schedule. But this jarring contrast between that rapid, triumphant advancement and what came next is absolutely crucial, because that incredible momentum came to a sudden, grinding halt the second they hit the German border.
So, what stopped them? The Siegfried Line. Built by 500,000 men working 20-hour days, this was a massive 600-kilometer defensive wall securing Germany's western border. We're talking 22,000 bunkers and brutal concrete anti-tank obstacles, famously known as Dragon's Teeth. Now, for years, Nazi propaganda had successfully magnified the psychological terror of this barrier. Even American military training films used German clips to depict it as this totally insurmountable wall. The reality? Well, once American troops actually breached those anti-tank barriers, the line's real military value was somewhat limited. But the psychological effect was very real. It made the invading troops highly insecure as they took their first actual steps onto the territory of the Third Reich.
And this brings us to a massively deadly miscalculation by American commanders. The Allies expected to just push eastward, right through the middle of the Hurtgenwald, quickly reach the Rhine and the Ruhr industrial region, and basically end the war. They completely underestimated the terrain. On the flip side, the Germans, whose troops were actually exhausted and desperate at this point, used this incredibly dense forest to buy precious time. It allowed them to dig into those bunkers, rebuild their defensive lines, and even mobilize the Volkssturm, which was a home guard made up mostly of old men and boys.
Which leads us to Part 2, into the Green Hell, the reality of forest warfare. Because instead of going around the forest to the north, commanders sent their troops descending straight into a 10-kilometer-wide wall of dense trees.
The uniquely lethal process of forest warfare totally neutralized any advantages the Americans had in armor. Just imagine the process. Step 1 meant agonizingly cutting paths through dense timber because, well, tanks can't exactly drive over massive centuries-old trees. Step 2, navigating ground thoroughly saturated with hidden landmines. And Step 3 was assaulting stubbornly resistant enemy soldiers who were already deeply entrenched in hidden concrete bunkers. It was painstakingly slow, and it was absolutely lethal. To really grasp this massive strategic failure, we have to look at the deeply personal terror on the ground. Take this quote from U.S. soldier James Cullen. During the fighting, he was struck by a tremendous blow from shrapnel. He looked down, saw blood pouring out right over his heart, and had this exact, terrifying thought. That was the daily reality for the troops, a constant, unyielding vulnerability.
And if the combat wasn't bad enough, the environment itself became a deadly enemy. The autumn of 1944 was unusually wet and cold. Freezing rain transitioned right into snow. Soldiers were spending their nights in waterlogged foxholes that offered virtually no protection from the elements. And then there were the tree bursts. These were artillery shells designed to hit the tops of the massive forest canopy, exploding and raining thousands of lethal fragments down on anyone below.
Add in impassable mud that quickly severed critical supply lines, and troops were left completely isolated in a literal green hell.
Part 3. Death Valley, the Cow Valley disaster. Let's move to November 1944, to one of the darkest chapters of the battle, the disastrous push toward the villages of Wassenach and Schmick.
The topographical miscalculation here is honestly almost hard to believe. Looking at a map, commanders saw a footpath winding down into a valley and up the other side. They just assumed they could move necessary troops, heavy weapons, and Sherman tanks right across it. But in reality, these were deep, steep, 150-meter-high hills. Those muddy footpaths were completely impassable for heavy armor. It led to utter disaster. Tanks crashed down the steep slopes, supply lines collapsed, exhausted soldiers fell into a panic, and German units completely cut them off in a valley the Americans would soon dub Death Valley.
But right in the middle of all that horror, there's this incredible story of ingenuity. Tony Vaccaro was a 22-year-old Italian-American soldier who arrived in the Hurtgenwald with a camera and a dream of being a photographer. Under constant, relentless artillery fire, he used the environment around him to document the war. While the other GIs slept, the muddy earth became his darkroom. He literally used the metal shells of his comrades' helmets as trays to mix his chemicals and develop combat photos in the dead of night.
For Vaccaro, this singular obsessive focus on a personal mission was a psychological lifeline. In a forest where just surviving felt like a miracle, tricking officers into letting him take photos gave him a purpose. It was a coping mechanism that helped this young man psychologically survive the terrifying, deafening barrage of the green hell.
Part 4. Aftermath and Recovery, a Ruined Landscape. So fast forward past the brutal winter pushes and the distraction of the Battle of the Bulge further south. By February 1945, the fighting in the Hurtgenwald finally came to a close. The Americans advanced, the dams were secured, and the way to the Rhine was clear. But what exactly was left behind?
12,000. That is the sheer volume of destruction embedded into the earth. Researchers estimate that in just a single afternoon, during one localized attack, the Americans fired roughly 12,000 grenades. Now, if you assume a typical 15% dud rate, that means the ground was literally seeded with unexploded ordnance.
Imagine being an evacuated civilian returning to this. They faced a harrowing reality, trying to rebuild their lives directly on top of a highly lethal former battlefield. Their villages were reduced completely to silent rubble. Food was so scarce that locals survived by scavenging abandoned, wrecked GI tanks just to find tins of canned corned beef. Tragically, those unexploded munitions we just talked about claimed many lives. Children died playing with explosives, including a really heartbreaking instance of a little girl who lost her hand because she mistook a grenade for a bottle of perfume. On top of all that, civilians faced the deeply traumatic task of finding and respectfully clearing the half-rotten bodies of fallen soldiers left behind in the woods.
Part 5. A Forest Still Scarred, the Legacy Today. Let's zoom out to the present day, because a battle of this magnitude doesn't just wash away with time.
Today, the villages of Wassenach and Hurtgen are home to massive war cemeteries. Over 5,000 fallen soldiers rest here. Many of the German dead were painstakingly recovered by a former German army captain named Julius Erasmus, who actually dedicated the rest of his life to searching the forest so these men could have a final resting place. Today, these solemn sites serve as a complex meeting point where veterans from both sides, former enemies, have gathered to find some sort of closure.
There's this really stark contrast when you visit today. If you walk through the Hurtgenwald now, the surface appears to be a calm, level green space full of popular hiking trails, but the ground beneath tells a completely different story. It's still highly fortified with hidden, unexploded ordnance. Bomb disposal experts are continually called in to remove grenades, some of which look deceivingly like simple cigars, and researchers use scientific methods to map out the hidden layers of this battlefield. The toxic, metallic reality of 1944 is still lurking just inches below the topsoil.
I want to conclude the historical narrative with this poignant realization from an American veteran who returned to the Hurtgenwald decades later. Overcome with tears, remembering the friends he lost in the ugly futility of the conflict, he noted that the trouble mankind makes stems from our divisions. Underneath the uniforms, the tragedy is that we are all simply humans, sharing the exact same earth.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We see the trees growing back and the hiking trails clearing the rubble, but the invisible scars remain. When nature reclaims a battlefield so thoroughly, how do we ensure the devastating human cost of the green hell is never forgotten? Take a moment to reflect on that. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex and absolutely vital piece of history.